Thursday. So, all right. Check out your sticky post on Reddit. I'll go check out Reddit. All right. Is this a good way to handle it? Adventure pre-release revealed chart. All right. But this goes to. All right. Cool. This works. We'll do it like this for now, at least. So, let me window capture, add. Here we'll remove this. Yes. And then we will add. All right, sweet. So this is what we're gonna be looking at right now. So, here, post on Twitter. All right, so League of Explorers. Just to start things off, I think that the set looks pretty cool. It's really interesting to see that Hearthstone is now basically creating new ground as far as content is concerned. Previously, all of the Hearthstone's adventures had been based on raid instances and such in World of Warcraft, and now we're gonna see. Let me switch this to this. Hold on. Vision, move up. Nope. No. There we go. All right, so yeah, League of Explorers. Here we go. Hold on, dude. So League of Explorers, the new adventure for Hearthstone, looks really cool. It is really exciting that it is actually a set that is going to be creating sort of new story ground in Hearthstone. The fact that it is an adventure that, rather than using existing content from World of Warcraft, really treads new ground. We will see some familiar things, some characters at least, that are from World of Warcraft, but it's interesting to see the fact that Hearthstone is now really creating its own stories in the World of Warcraft, essentially. So, pretty cool there. And then, the theme of adventurers and searching for treasure and whatnot, and exploring the world is one that I think is very appropriate for an adventure and can, I think, give a different way of looking at like what you're doing over the course of the various stages of the different wings that are going on in the adventure itself. So anyway, let's jump into the cards right away. So Raven Idol. We'll start with the Druid cards. Raven Idol. This is kind of a weird card. It's a one cost, discover a minion or discover a spell. So this is one of the Druid's sort of themes is flexibility. We see, with the sort of shape-shifting modes of lots of the different cards. They choose cards like Keeper of the Grove, like Ancient of Lore, Ancient of War, which sadly mostly has one mode. And this is about as sort of modular a thing as you're going to get. That, it's like, okay, right now I need to try and find maybe something on curve. Right now I need to try and find something that can react to what my opponent's doing. It's 1 mana. So this is super potentially flexible card that I think has a lot of interesting implications for allowing decks to do a variety of things outside of just the very set number of options you have in a single deck normally. My inclination is that it likely won't really see all that much constructed play, simply because usually when you're building a deck, you want it to do a certain thing rather than necessarily just have a lot of flexibility. And in particular, discover a minion. There's so many minions that this could hit. Versus like discover a spell, it's like, yeah, like I think that the flexibility of being able to find a certain Druid spell, having a choice of a range of them at a given time in the game is likely useful. So I imagine that mode is going to be the more commonly used one if someone is playing with this card. But the fact that it can sort of fill out your curve with the minion side potentially, and allow you to do things that you weren't necessarily sure that you need to do during a game is kind of interesting. But my guess is that this really won't be a particularly powerful constructed card, but it seems like it's a solid arena card potentially, just because filling out your curve or finding things that are appropriate for the particular moment is worth the additional sort of tax on the spell in arena. Then next we have Mounted Raptor. So this is a pretty powerful card. It is a 3/2 that Death Rattle summons a random 1-cost minion. If we compare this, say, to Harvest Golem, that's probably the most apt comparison for Mounted Raptor. I've actually seen a lot of people suggesting that Mounted Raptor is like super strong. It's like a new piloted shredder or whatever. But I do think there's already a comparable card in the game in Harvest Golem, and I think that generally the 1-cost minion that you're going to get from Mounted Raptor on average is worse than Damaged Golem. So the fact that this is a beast, or that you want the 3/2 upfront body, I think is actually versus a 2/3 from Harvest Golem is really the place where you'd be making that sort of decision. Would you rather have a 3/2 beast, or would you rather have a 2/3 mech? Because that's where the real differentiation of these cards feels like it is. So my inclination to this card is, potentially a card that could see play, but is not nearly the sort of powerhouse that people seem to be suggesting in their comparisons to Pilot Shredder, because there's already a card that effectively does what this card does, except it doesn't really see that much play. So I do think that this is possibly a card that could find a home in Beast synergy based Druid decks, because that's something that I think does need help. And maybe we'll see a bit more of that, because Mounted Raptor, it certainly is a strong minion, but I don't think it's going to be changing the face of the metagame in itself, except for the fact that it may encourage these sort of new deck builds. Next we have Jungle Moonkin. This is again a beast, which is weird from a WoW lore perspective, because Moonkin could not be scare beasted. I should know, I played a hunter, and he could never scare beast the chicken. But as a 4/4 for 4, not super powerful, but the fact that its ability is actually really high impact. Both players have spell damage +2. If you have a way to make strong use of spell damage, this is an extremely powerful effect. This is obviously super powerful with swipe. It's super powerful in particular with effects that are leveraging the spell damage more than just like an individual thing. Like, for instance, this is not particularly good with like Wrath. It's fine, but it's not that much better than just like Ogre Magi, where you're getting marginal additional value, but potentially risking your opponent also being able to use the value from the spell damage. So here I think that if you're using this with say Swipe, with say Starfall, which are cards that, because they are multi-target, gain additional benefit from spell damage compared to the average card, this could be pretty strong. Or if somehow you can do the classic Moonkin spamming Moonfire, which was really what Moonkin did in WoW, in my experience at least. Because if you cast multiple Moonfires in a turn, because you're leveraging the cost of that, you're leveraging the fact that this is a really cheap effect. For instance, similar with Living Roots, maybe this is a powerful card because you're able to do 4 damage with Living Roots for 1 mana. But generally speaking, I think that this is a card that is probably not going to find its way into all that many decks. Its stats aren't great, and it is a really big potential drawback if you do also play against an opponent who can leverage the spell damage as well. Moving on to Hunter. First we'll start with Dart Trap. Dart Trap, when an opposing hero power is used, deal 5 damage to a random enemy. This is a weird trap. I like the fact that it's a trap that's punishing something different than any of the other Hunter traps. The other Hunter traps were generally all about like punishing your opponent for attacking. This is punishing them for playing a new type of effect. And this is actually a quite powerful trap effect. If you do get your Dart Trap off, it's either likely to kill one of your opponent's creatures or do 5 damage to them, both of which is pretty powerful. The problem is that the kind of deck that wants either of those isn't necessarily the same deck. Like, if this were deal 5 damage to a random enemy minion, or deal 5 damage to your opponent, either of those would be a stronger effect here. And I think that it's unlikely that like a Face Hunter style deck would want this because it's not reliable in terms of being able to actually deal damage to your opponent because, hey, it requires a hero power, and B, it can potentially just hit a minion rather than something like Explosive Trap, which even though it's not going to do anything near as much damage as this, it is able to at least be guaranteed to damage your opponent, which is the goal. So I like this card conceptually, but I'm hard-pressed to figure out a place where it would likely be played. Next we have Desert Camel, and this is a pretty interesting card. So it's a 2/4 beast for 3, which in itself is actually pretty attractive. The fact that Desert Camel is a beast that is very likely to survive anything that is played on turn 3. It has higher health than most minions have attack at 2 or 3 mana. So it's a very likely beast to be able to stick around for something like Houndmaster. So I think that this is a very attractive card for a mid-range style of Hunter deck, even before you look at its ability. Even before you're paying attention to the battle cry on this, just 2/4 beast for 3 has like some appeal just because of its ability to enable things like Houndmaster. So the battle cry, put a 1-cost minion from each deck onto the battlefield, is interesting because there are a lot of games in which this is just not a drawback. Like you'll get a 1-cost minion, and your opponent will get a 1-cost minion in a lot of situations. But if your opponent has no 1-cost minions in their deck, say they're playing something like Control Warrior or Patron Warrior, almost any warrior deck really. Say they're playing something like Freeze Mage, say they're playing something like Midrange Druid. This is just a 2/4 minion that comes with most likely something like a Web Spinner. And that's like a really high value minion. So I like the fact that this is a card that its power level is pretty contingent on the sort of matchup that you're in, and there's ways to leverage it either way. Like the fact that it's just a beast that's like to stay in play, and it's a very high value beast when you play it in a situation when you can mitigate the drawback, or against a deck where you can mitigate a drawback. It is, however, potentially a risky card to play if you're playing a, say, like aggressive deck, like Face Hunter, like Secret Paladin. It's like if your opponent gets a free Secret Keeper and you don't already have a board presence, like that can be a disaster. So I'll be interested to see what sort of impact this has on the way people build their decks and the sort of Hunter decks that do get built. I do think this is a card that will pretty much certainly see constructed play because it's certainly very powerful. Then Explorer's Hat. So this is kind of a cool card. I'm kind of sad that it's a Hunter card because this feels like a card that would go great in different decks, like for different classes. Like for instance, this would be a great Priest card, I feel like, because buffing your minions is much more valuable for Priest, and Priest already has a number of significant minion buffs like Powered Shield, like Valen's Chosen, that could very easily go in a deck with like Lightbane, Deathbane, and Dragonkin Sorcerer. Like this is a card that if you have enough stuff like this, and in particular this card exactly because it can trigger multiple different minions when you play a spell targeting this triggers. So that I think is pretty cool. But I don't really see this as being something that Hunter is necessarily looking for. There aren't really that many places where I'm trying to just like incrementally buff my minions in Hunter. It could be interesting in like Lock and Load. If you're playing a deck that has Lock and Load, this is a card that can trigger multiple you can get some value out of, get it back to your hand, trigger Lock and Load later. It's kind of cool, but I don't really see a place that this is going to find a home, at least among existing constructed decks, and I don't really see it being in Hunter as particularly inspiring a new Hunter type of strategy. All right, next we have Forgotten Torch, and this is the 3 mana, deal 3 damage, shuffling Roaring Torch into your deck that deals 6 damage. Also costs 3 mana. This is kind of neat. I like the fact that you're gaining some sort of future efficiency, basically adding additional threat to your, or total burn damage to your deck. I think that adding additional cards to your deck is something that is a pretty unique element of Hearthstone in the way that certain matchups play out, and it has very different value depending on the kind of matchup you're playing. Spell damage like this, or spells that just do damage like this, I think are less compelling as additional cards to add to your deck compared to something like a real threat. When you're playing a game that is likely to go to fatigue, you want things that can cause repeatable damage. Like it's one of the reasons that that Paladin hero power is so effective against Control Warrior, because you have this infinite ability to generate threat, and having the ability to continue to both be less likely to fatigue, as well as to be able to have more threats your opponent has to deal with, is a very real thing in control matchups. But this sort of card is not really doing that. This is a sort of card that it is adding one amount of set damage to your deck. It does incrementally reduce your likelihood of fatiguing. Like if you are playing a controlling style of deck and you find yourself in positions where you are threatened with fatigue against a deck like Control Warrior, this is a card that will help reset your fatigue, which is interesting. But I don't know that that's enough of an appeal to play this over something which may be more efficient at interacting. Because obviously, anytime you put a card into your deck, you have to be playing it instead of a different card. So I'm not sure what this would replace in, say, a control mage style of deck. And I'm also curious how the exact mechanic works. Like, say if you're in fatigue, say you're 4 cards into fatigue and you cast this, do you reset your fatigue to 0? That's actually a question that I don't know the answer to. But it does actually make the dynamic of having just one of this card in your deck, if that's how it does work, very, very different. Because if this completely resets your fatigue and you can play a fatigue game where you will suddenly not be in fatigue anymore, I think that's actually extremely powerful in some matchups and would significantly change the way that I think about this card. All right, moving on. We have Ethereal Conjurer. 5-cost 6/3 battle cry, discover a spell. So that is kind of weird. We've seen some 5-cost 6/3s in our day that none of which have ultimately been effective. Like Hemet, I don't even know the name of the card. The Paladin mech that gets Divine Shield whenever you play another mech. That card is all these cards are kind of neat and potentially powerful, but their body is just so weak. 3 health on a 5-cost minion is extremely weak, and Battlecry Discover Spell, again, this is kind of like what we were talking about with Roaring Torch. The ability to add additional stuff to your deck has some value in some matchups, and this actually adds it directly to your hand, which is more powerful clearly than adding it to your deck, because you immediately gain the value out of it. It's actually value there, but it's the body that you're getting in the first place just feels pretty weak. Compare this to obviously it's the impact of a spell that you're going to discover from Conjurer is going to be higher than a spare part, but compare this to Toshli. Toshli costs 1 more mana, gives you 2 spare parts, Battle Cry and on Death Rattle, and just has actually really, really good stats at 5/7 for 6, whereas this is going to die to a Knife Juggler or a Piloted Shredder or anything down the curve. So this is, I feel like, a pretty weak card overall, just because what it is providing in terms of an actual body in play is relatively low impact, and doesn't really have that much board presence for effectively the ability of getting a spell, which you could just play with spells instead of this. And obviously this gives you the body in play that does matter, but it is going to be a pretty big loss in tempo when your opponent is able to kill this with something far down the curve. All right, well, last in Mage, we have Animated Armor. Now, this is an interesting card. Your hero can only take 1 damage at a time. The problem with this card is it's effectively just, in most situations, or at least in minion-based situations, this is effectively taunt. But that's actually, it is taunt that if your opponent doesn't actually have minion-based damage, is pretty tough for them to deal with. If you play this against, say, a Freeze Mage opponent who has just Alex Straza'd you, they have to kill this before they can actually damage you. which is obviously way better than if this were a taunt. It's kind of like Both. This is very similar to Both in that your opponent has to get rid of it before they can kill you. It's not as good against multiple small things as Both, but no one really played Both to begin with. So, but this is, I think, potentially reasonably effective against like Face Hunter style decks, where they're just like trying to bring you out with their hero power and kill command, and even incrementally reducing that damage by a bit is pretty valuable. That said, its stats are pretty bad, and it's going to, I think, be difficult to justify putting this into a lot of different decks. But I do like the concept of it. I think that the idea of cards that do this sort of thing, that change the way that the game plays out in a certain way, is pretty cool. I'm just not convinced that this is going to find a home over something like Healbot, which is going to be doing the same kind of thing in a lot of situations. All right, then we will go to Paladin. Sacred Trial. Well, this is actually a very powerful effect. As to whether this is better than existing Paladin secrets and may find a home in Mysterious Challenger decks, it's unclear. But like if your opponent has some guys and you play Mysterious Challenger, and this is one of the possible things that can come up, it can really, really screw up your opponent's plans. So I think that the threat of Sacred Trial out of Mysterious Challenger decks is a real thing. But I don't know that it's really a card that will end up replacing any of the cards that is more guaranteed to have an impact on the game. I think that if this were in any other class than Paladin, it almost certainly wouldn't see play, because the fact that it is something that you can fetch as one of many things from Mysterious Challenger is one of the reasons that this is potentially a compelling card. But it is definitely going to throw a wrench in a lot of people's plans. If this is even like something that they have to keep in mind when they're playing the game. The big problem is that your opponent has to allow you effectively to trigger Sacred Trial. It's actually extremely easy to play around, because as long as you have anything that they can attack their minions into, they can just kind of naturally play around it and go down to 2 minions. But I imagine this is going to be a card that gets someone real good, and then they'll never stop playing around it again. All right, Keeper of Uldaman. So obviously its stats are not particularly strong. It's a 4-cost 3/4, but the fact that its battle cry is set a minion's attack and health to 3, which is cool thematically, because it's like I will set your set your stats to just enough that I can take you down and not die myself. That's cool. That said, I like the fact that it is both a potentially offensive and defensively oriented card. Like you can use this with your hero power, with Silverhand recruits you get from Muster for Battle, in order to turn them into real threats. And you can also use it to mitigate your opponent's threats. If you're able to, shrink your opponent's Doctor Boom, or their Mysterious Challenger, or their Tyrion, or whatever, to make it so that you can interact with it more favorably, along with just being able to actually get some value out of your own, effectively token creatures. So I don't really know that it's going to find a home, because it is relatively situational, and there's a lot of competition. You're fighting against things like Piloted Shredder, like Murloc Knight at the 4-cost. So it is a very, very contentious mana cost slot. I mean, Blessing of Kings, Truce of a Champion, Consecration, like these are all really really powerful things. But be able to buff, say, an Argent Squire or an Anoyotron or things like that is one of the things that makes this card potentially pretty attractive. So I think this is a card that could easily be a lot better than it looks at first glance. So I would certainly not dismiss it yet, and would not be surprised to see it find a home. All right, Anything Can Happen. This is a really weird card. I do think the fact that this set has a number of cards that are potentially able to encourage people to build new types of decks, like Murloc Paladin. That's cool. But this costs 10 mana. And 10 is, in case you weren't aware, a lot of mana. That's the most you can have. So you'd have to have like 7 really powerful Murlocs for this to really be all that effective a spell. And I don't know that there are 7 powerful Murlocs you can reasonably have. I mean, like, maybe this is some sort of like end game finisher in some Murloc Knight deck. Because, you don't necessarily have to have that many Murlocs in your deck because Murloc Knight can generate them. So maybe your deck is only powerful Murlocs, like Murloc Knights and War Leaders and Old Murkai and whatever else, rather than necessarily being a card that goes into a dedicated Murloc deck. You do need to have had 7 die that game in order to take advantage of it, but the biggest problem with this is less the deck building constraints and more just the mana cost. 10 means that it is only going to come up in games that are going to enormous attrition, and those are games where Paladin, and especially Paladin decks that already have Murloc Knight, is typically going to already be very powerful. So this feels like it's more of just like a wacky cool card, rather than a card that is legitimately going to be particularly effective in constructed play. And frankly, there's a room for that. I don't think that even if this card never sees play in a competitive constructed environment, that's a problem. Like something crazy and wacky that anyone wants to even try and think about and build a deck around has a place in a card game. But this is not one that I expect to find its way into tournament play. All right. So Priest, Museum Curator. A 2-cost Battlecry, discover a Death Rattle card. It's a 1/2. So Priest is a class that in many cases suffers from not really necessarily having great things to do on the second turn in many cases. We've seen this quite a bit over the years, basically, that Priest has existed, that the threaten, heal your opponent is often one of your common plays. It's a lot less likely to happen with the modern Dragon Priest style decks because they are much more proactive. But having a card like this, like Discover Death Rattle card, there's a lot of very good Death Rattle cards. And be able to find like a Dark Cultist, be able to find a Sylvanas, be able to find even like a Harvest Golem or whatever, are all pretty powerful effects. I'm not sure that there's going to be a deck that is like looking for a 2-drop so badly though, and like cares that much about the 1/2 that it is going to be playing Museum Curator over something else basically. It is nice that it's something that you can play that will contest like 2/1s on that your opponent might play on turn 1, that also guarantees you're getting value out of it because it's giving you this Battlecry effect. And this is also a pretty important thing. Like you could play in that spot like something like a Loot Hoarder or a Novice Engineer that draw you cards instead. But as I was saying earlier, with respect to the Roaring Torch and such, being able to add cards to your deck is a very, very important and relevant thing as opposed to drawing cards. Like Priest, in particular, controlling Priest style of decks are actually very likely in a lot of matchups to go to fatigue. So adding a card to your hand from outside the game in those games is way more powerful than drawing a card because it doesn't bring you closer to fatigue while also generating additional resources. And if the 1/2 body, even if it doesn't matter at all, or matters very, very little, it's still not counting against the resources you have to win the game in those matchups. And frankly, a lot of Death Rattle cards are just very good. So I think that this is a very reasonable card that is like a early minion that can contest the board, not against a lot of stuff, but basically against 2/1 minions. But that still is able to provide you with the ability to find something that can be useful in a matchup against more controlling decks. So one of the things that I also think, just talk about the Discover mechanic in general, I think that it's really interesting that it is basically enabling a kind of random element to games that is you're able to craft the strategy around. And I actually really like cards like, say, Web Spinner, cards like Unstable Portal, because they are cards that allow you to sort of try to build a game plan around these things which are not normally a part of your deck. And Museum Curator can create those same sort of strategic plans where it's like, okay, I got a, I don't know, piloted Sky Golem off of my museum curator. So now, like, I can like try to play in such a way that I'm able to pressure my opponent with this. Or if I got, a explosive sheep, and the fact that you get to discover a card, meaning you choose one from 3 options, allows you to not only craft a game plan around what you do get, but decide which of those things makes the most sense for the particular game that you're playing right now. So anyway, I do think this is an interesting card, and I'm certainly going to be experimenting with it because I do think that it is a potentially valuable minion for the early game against some aggressive decks that can still be relevant in terms of the way your game plays out against control. All right, next we have Entomb. This is one of the cards that I'm probably most excited about in the new expansion, and it's for a number of reasons that I talked about already. The fact that this is a card which, it is just a great removal spell that avoids Death Rattle effects or Divine Shield effects, which is extremely strong to begin with in a lot of ways. We've seen Recycle in Druid. It didn't really see much play, but Recycle, there's a couple of problems with it that doesn't necessarily mesh with what Druid is trying to do. You don't really have late game focused Druid control decks that want to, are focused on the value of removing your thing and like getting rid of Death Rattle effects, whatever. It already also has Keeper of the Grove to be able to silence those Death Rattle effects, so it's not nearly as relevant. It also, if you were playing a long control game with Recycle, your opponent can just redraw that card. So it's not something that actually works with a strategy that is potentially going to go to fatigue. Entomb is actually both in a class that really wants this kind of thing. One of the strongest cards against Priest, period, against any Priest deck like that is playing it all to the board, has always been Sylvanas. I've always been super frustrated anytime I'm playing a Priest deck and my opponent plays Sylvanas, and it's like, well, I have no clean way to kill this. Basically, to sacrifice my entire board or death it and then try and kill my own thing as efficiently as possible. But Entomb not only mitigates the Death Rattle effect of Sylvanas because it shuffles the card into your deck rather than destroying it, so there's no Death Rattle effect. But it also gives you that resource potentially later in the game. Right now, a lot of control Priest decks actually struggle against control Warrior, and there's a couple of reasons for this. One, the control Warrior decks have the ability to play really effective board control games, eliminate all of your individual threats, and then just use Justicar Trueheart, tank up a million times, and win the game. Because they can just play Fatigue better than you can. But with Entomb, you're doing a couple of things. One, you have an incredibly efficient answer to any of their minions, including Sylvanas, which has historically been a big problem. But it also is giving you more cards in your deck and higher threat density, more big things your opponent has to remove. So if you Entomb your opponent's Sylvanas, not only do they lose their Sylvanas and not get the Death Rattle effect, but in a game that is likely to go to Fatigue, they then later on have to deal with your Sylvanas. So this card in any control Priest deck that is potentially likely to go to Fatigue against a Warrior deck is extremely powerful. But it's kind of like Mind Control in that way, but the fact that Entomb costs 6 means it's a totally reasonable card to actually use to remove things in other matchups. Mind Control is basically, this is my trump card against other control decks, but it's horrible everywhere else. But Entomb, you can Entomb a Savannah Highmane, and that's great because you've removed your opponent's Savannah Highmane from play. They don't get their Death Rattle. Fantastic. I just hit my mic and boom. Boom too, Dr. Boom. You can get their Dr. Boom in your deck, and you don't deal with the boom bots, but you're able to remove it, totally reasonably efficiently. It's not nearly as efficient as Shadow Word Death, but you can play this alongside some number of copies of Shadow Word Death, and it's still very strong. Anyway, let's go to the next card. Entomb, great. All right, Excavated Evil. One thing that I have talked about feeling like there's not enough of in Hearthstone are ways to come back when you're behind. And things like Hellfire, I think, are actually kind of outclassed by the minions that exist right now. You can Hellfire a Secret Paladin deck on turn 4, and they can end up still having a ton of stuff in play because they have, their Redemption and Piloted Shredder and Minibot. None of those die, and you just kind of get wrecked. But with Excavated Evil, this is, I think, still a powerful card. It's like Hellfire in that it's maybe not quite efficient enough at what it does to be like a great response when you're really far behind. But the fact that it shuffles into your opponent's deck, this is an interesting thing because in a matchup against aggressive decks, that's actually a detriment to them most of the time. Like if you Excavated Evil, and you shuffle your Excavated Evil into your Face Hunter opponent's deck, it's horrible for them. They draw Excavated Evil instead of a real card, and it's basically just they skip their draw. So it's the fact that it kind of looks like it's a drawback. It's like, oh, now your opponent can control when they cast it next time. In a lot of cases, just won't be. So that's interesting to me that the fact that you're basically cursing your opponent's deck, making it worse. In many cases, when you are going to be using this effect, is very powerful. So this is a card I'm definitely going to experiment with. I do think that it is more appealing than a lot of other sort of options here, but it may just be too weak for how much it costs and how much it does against mid-range style of decks, because 3 damage for 5 mana is just not that much. But we'll see. Next, all right, Tomb Pillager. So all of the rogue cards in this set are minions. And I've seen some people complaining about that rogue is a spell-based class, so you want to have more spells to go with your combo stuff. But A, Tomb Pillager is great with combo stuff because its Death Rattle gives you a coin. And B, I actually think that it's pretty important that the cards that classes get try to open up new strategies rather than just cementing the strategies that already exist. It's much easier also from a design and development perspective. Well, easier. It's much more effective to create cards that create new strategies or encourage new strategies than replace cards in other strategies without just purely power creeping. Okay, well, are we going to see a card that invalidates okay, this is better than Piloted Shredder, this is better than Shielded Minibot. It's those are really obviously really hard cards to outclass, and you don't want to just be doing that because otherwise the power of your game just keeps increasing, and that's in itself kind of a bad thing. But with cards like this, they encourage a different kind of deck for rogues. I actually think that Tomb Pillager might encourage players to have more sort of big minion late game style rogue decks. If your opponent kills your Tomb Pillager, you get a coin. That's actually very powerful. And normally having a minion like this that is relatively vulnerable, it's a 5/4 for 4 mana, so it's going to die down to a lot of things. But if that means that you get to play your Dr. Boom or whatever, your Anubarak a turn earlier because you have the coin, that's actually very, very strong. So I think that this is a card that may help enable more sort of minion-based and ramp-style minion-based rogue decks. I don't know that we're going to see, this guy paired with Cut Purse or whatever, because that card I think is probably just too bad. But this, because it is a Death Rattle effect, even though it is vulnerable, given its stats and cost, you still get that powerful effect out of it. So you can ramp to your big minion after your opponent does kill your Pillager. All right, and next we have Pit Snake. So Pit Snake, basically a pretty basic card, pretty simple card. It's a 2/1 beast for 1. Whenever it damages a minion, kill it. So this is the Emperor Cobra, except more efficient combination of stats. It is more vulnerable. Obviously the fact that it's 1 health means that lots of things very easily kill it. I don't know really where this might have a home. There's no real beast synergies in Rogue, and would you play this over, say, Clockwork Gnome, Leper Gnome, whatever? It's this is a nice minion because it can kill up the curve in the situations where that comes up. Your opponent can't just clear it with a larger minion. But I don't know. It's hard for me to find a place that I want to play this card. I imagine that if you're playing an aggressive style of rogue deck, something like South Sea Deckhand or Leper Gnome or whatever is much more likely to find a home. But this is in itself a totally reasonable card. I would have been. I'm curious to see why this is really a rogue card. This feels like this could have just been a druid card, and been in the beast druid style of decks. Could have been interesting, but anyway, as it stands, probably not going to see a ton of play in my mind. I think that there are just, for anything that your rogue deck is trying to do, probably better options. unless what you're trying to do is just kill big minions with your minions, and then hey, Pit Snake's for you. So Unearthed Raptor. I think it's a pretty important card for Rogue, because it's just a solid body. One of the things that Rogue has lacked in itself is minions that have reasonable bodies that actually contest the board well. You basically see Rogue decks playing all like SI agents and Earthring Farseers. Nothing that has great stats by itself. And obviously, Rogue's already had the opportunity, if they wanted, to play cards like Spider Tank. But Spider Tank is not as powerful, clearly, as Unearthed Raptor, unless you're getting some benefit out of the mech synergies. Unearthed Raptor is interesting. You can play, you obviously want to be playing cheap Death Rattle minions that you can combine it with, or potentially playing this later on for powerful Death Rattle minions. Like, if you have a Sylvanas in play and you just copy the Sylvanas' Death Rattle, then trade off the Sylvanas, you get an additional trigger of that. I'm curious how Unearthed Raptor actually works with a Nubarok. If you copy a Nubarok's Death Rattle trigger and it dies, does the Raptor return to your hand? Or do you get a copy of a Nubarok in your hand? I'm just curious how that's actually coded. We'll find that out. Don't worry, we'll find that out. But I imagine that if you want to play this in your deck, you're going to want to have cheap Death Rattle minions like Loot Hoarders or Leper Gnomes or whatever, so you can gain those effects as well. So, but yeah, I do think this is a card that we'll very likely see play alongside the Tomb Pillager in those sort of more minion focused Rogue decks that I hope that we'll be able to see with these new cards from this expansion. All right. Next in Shaman, we have Tunnel Trog. So Tunnel Trog, this is basically the Shaman Mana Worm. Whenever you overload, gain +1 attack per locked mana crystal. It's a 1/3 for 1. One of the problems that Shaman decks have often had is that overload is a mechanic that punishes you pretty heavily in terms of spending your resources now and being locked for later to gain something immediately. And if you're only trading like 1-for-1, or you're only trading like you're not like really profitably getting ahead with your overload spells, you'll just fall behind as you get overloaded basically, and you can't keep up. But this is kind of like an additional zombie chow for a sort of mid-range overload style shaman deck, and it's really powerful. This card, it's a zombie chow with no drawback in many games. And pairs extremely well with a lot of the early overload cards that you would not necessarily want to play before, but like if you play Tunnel Trog on 1, Totem Golem on 2, you have a 2/3 and a 3/4, super early in the game. That's very, very powerful. Similarly, you can make cards like Feral Spirits or Lightning Storm, which kind of have gotten outclassed as the game has progressed, and cards have often, more powerful cards have come into existence that don't line up, or rather that those cards don't line up very well against. But if you are buffing a Tunnel Trog when you're overloading for 2, really powerful. So I am excited to try building shaman decks, like mid-range style shaman decks, using this card. I think it's super good, and I have high hopes for shaman to find success in the hands of someone other than Pim Ping Ho. Alright, so Rumbling Elemental. After you play a Battlecry minion, deal 2 damage to your random enemy, 2/6 for 4 mana. I don't know that this is really enough to want me to build a Battlecry deck around it, but this definitely encourages you specifically to play cheap Battlecry minions. Like, you want to play, things like Gnomish or Novice Inventor and not a Gnomish Inventor, just like things that are giving you some sort of value and potentially cycling you through to more stuff. I think this card is like fine. Like a 2/6 for 4, clearly stats that make you want to keep it in play for longer. Maybe we'll be able to have enough sort of things that encourage you to play Battlecry deck like this and Crowd Favorites and Brand Bronzebeard, who we'll get to eventually. That like all of that comes together. There are some powerful Shaman Battlecry cards regardless. We have Fire Elemental and such that you'll naturally want to play in that kind of deck. So it'll be interesting to see. It's possible that this is a powerful effect. I mean, if you are naturally already playing a lot of strong Battlecry effects, then maybe this is something that you'll pair them with. But I don't know that 2 damage to a random enemy at this cost, at this like point in the game, because you're basically not going to get a trigger on this until turn 5. And how powerful is dealing 2 damage to a random enemy on turn 5? It's pretty good, but I'm not sure how good. Just given how the game state can develop. But if you're able to trigger this multiple times, it's if you're playing like Inventor into Inventor or whatever, it's like, okay, Inventor to Engineer, something like that, or with Fire Elemental, those are all pretty powerful things. So I imagine this triggers after you have gotten the Battlecry effects. You won't have information about like, okay, I want to Fire Elemental your 5/5 because it's going to die to your Rumbling Elemental. You won't have that to inform your targeting decisions, but it's a pretty powerful effect. I'll definitely try exploring how to make it work, because it is tough to kill. 6 health for 4 mana is very tough to kill. So it'll be interesting to see if this is able to sort of build an archetype around it. And last, and perhaps least, every Fin is awesome. Give your minions +2/+2, cost 1 less for each Murloc you control. So obviously, if you're able to swarm the board with Murlocs and play this for super cheap, it's extremely powerful. As to whether that's a reasonable strategy, it's not entirely clear. The fact that this isn't a card that only goes in a Murloc deck. This is a card that's at its best if you have Murlocs. Like, this is kind of like a Bloodlust. It is, more expensive than Bloodlust. Clearly, it costs 7 rather than 5. But it's a permanent effect rather than a for the turn effect. And it boosts the health of your minions, which is very strong if you're actually building a board and trading. So this is clearly a card that is at its most effective in a deck that's generating a lot of stuff on the board. Things like Haunted Creeper, Nerubian Egg, things that are able to. I guess Nerubian Egg doesn't generate multiple things really, but things that ensure that you're going to have a board presence for a significant period of time. And frankly, the fact that Shaman has the hero power that just makes these totems, things that make your totems into real threats, are quite valuable. So I'm definitely going to try building a Murloc Shaman deck with this. There's a number of incentives to play it. There's Neptulon, there's the Sylphin Spirit Walker, none of which I think are as good as Murloc Knight in Paladin. So maybe Paladin's the true Murloc class, but this is an extremely powerful effect, especially if you're able to reduce it significantly for having a number of Murlocs in play. So certainly worth trying out, and we'll see if it is in fact awesome. All right, next we have Warlock with Dark Peddler. So, Battlecry, discover a 1-cost card, 2/2 for 1. There's a lot of powerful 1-cost Warlock cards, but this also can select from neutral minions. So, this is a strong value card, but given that Warlock is a class that doesn't really necessarily struggle with value, it's less exciting to me. You already have a hero power that just draws a card for 2 mana. So it's cards that give you incremental value in Warlock are less exciting than they are in a lot of other classes, I think. Just because you are less sort of starved for cards as resources compared to them. But there are a lot of just good 1-cost cards, and being able to find 1-cost cards that you can slot into your curve at some point during the game, it's in many cases going to be stronger than discover a 2-cost card. The 2-cost card has a higher impact, but is less able to be fit into your curve, and makes it more difficult to sort of create a game plan around it. But anyway, I think that this is a card that's certainly interesting, and I imagine people will experiment with, because hey, value, but not really anything that looks to define any kind of deck type, at least. All right, Curse of Rafam. Give your opponent a cursed card while they hold it. They do 2 damage in their turn. My understanding is that the cursed card is just a spell that costs 2 mana. So if your opponent, this is basically your opponent takes 2 damage until they spend the 2 mana to get rid of this, which is actually pretty cool. As to whether spending 2 mana of your own to do 2 damage to your opponent, and potentially more than that if they don't pay it off, is better than just playing a minion. Hard to really evaluate this. I like the concept of this card, because it's actually one of the things that's really cool about it. This like always beats Ice Block. If your opponent has Ice Block up, you can curse them, get them down to 1, and then just kill them with this because it triggers in their own turn. That's an interesting thing if you're playing a deck that's like potentially struggling with Freeze Mage. It's like, yeah, you just play this in your deck and you just kill them. It obviously has synergy with Loatheb, but it's not really what you're looking to do when you Loatheb them, I think, either. But no, I like that a card like this exists. I don't know that it will necessarily find play outside of, sort of hating on Freeze Mages or whatever, or hating on Ice Block in particular. But I mean, it could just be a relatively efficient way to do damage if you are putting pressure on your opponent and forcing them to use their mana to react to you to begin with. So that if they do use their mana to get rid of the curse card, they're stumbling a little bit. The fact that you're doing this instead of playing a minion, generally speaking, or instead of playing as strong a minion as you could, makes it a little bit less attractive to me. But yeah, I don't know. It's interesting, and I certainly think it's a cool card. All right, here we have Reliquary Seeker. 1 cost 1/1. If you have 6 other minions, gain +4/+4. I think it's difficult to make cheap Warlock cards because of life tap. So here's one. Definitely is works well with Implosion, Imp Gang Boss, whatever else. Being able to play any kind of undercosted minion is pretty exciting. I can't really ever see playing this rather than Sea Giant, because Sea Giant is, or at least before I'm already playing 2 Sea Giants. But I like the idea of the card. I just don't expect it to really find a home. All right, Obsidian Destroyer. It's a 7/7 for 7. At the end of your turn, summon a 1/1 Scarab with Taunt. It is hard for me to imagine a world in which this sees constructed play. It's more resilient than Hogger to mass removal effects, which is powerful when you're able to generate additional stuff. The fact that it dies to Big Game Hunter, kind of sad. The fact that it lines up, pretty poorly against something like Dr. Boom, because you get a 7/7 and 1/1/1. They get a 7/7 and 2/1/1s with more abilities. But it is a powerful card in Arena, and that's actually something that's very relevant, especially for Warriors. It's a common card that's a very high impact late game card, which is something that Warrior decks need in Arena. So it's important. I've talked about a lot of these cards in various contexts, but this is one that it's important to recognize. Even if this is a card that never sees constructed play, it has a relevant home in sort of the ecosystem of Hearthstone in general, simply because it plays a role in this particular format. Fierce Monkey. Similarly, this is a great card in Arena. A 3/4 taunt for 3, very, very powerful. I actually think it's a totally reasonable stat line for constructed too. It's 1 less health than a Sen'jin Shieldmaster for 1 less mana. The 1 less health matters a lot. It does line up poorly against True Silver, against Shredder or Swipe or whatever else. But it's also just cheaper. So the fact that you can get it down early on and defend yourself with minions is something that a lot of Warrior decks have often just not really been able to do. Most Warrior decks are built around using weapons early in the game and then transitioning to late game minions. But being able to have substantial minions early on is pretty strong. It also works potentially very well with Bolster. One of the problems with a lot of the Bolster decks is that a lot of the cheap taunt minions just aren't very good, and this is a very, very strong one that you can bolster up pretty effectively. So I like it. I think it will see play in certainly in Arena, and I would not be surprised to see it see play in Constructed as well. Cursed Blade. This is a cool card. Basically a cheaper War Axe that is worse at keeping you alive. War Axe mostly uses removal, but this is a kind of a scary card to just start attacking your opponent's minions with. It is potentially quite strong in an aggressive Warrior deck. It's effectively 6 damage for 1 mana. That you can play as soon as turn 1, and there's not that many attractive options for Warrior decks to play on turn 1. So if you just start going and attacking right away, it's kind of sweet. certainly not going to see play in control warrior style decks whatsoever. The fact that it is using your life total even more as a resource when warrior is a deck that does that to begin with is pretty scary. But I like the card. All right, neutral cards. Let's jump in. We'll start with the commons. Jeweled Scarab. So this is kind of like that, the Gnomish Inventor style thing. It's a 1/1 for 2. The fact that it's a beast could be relevant for a number of different decks. We could see this played in like mid-range style Hunter decks potentially. We could see it played in Beast Druid perhaps. But the fact that it's Battle Cry, discover a 3-cost card, is pretty relevant. It guarantees that you're able to fill in your curve the following turn. It can get spells, so if you're playing a class that has a lot of 3-cost spells you don't necessarily want to play on 3, like Mage, with a bunch of secrets, maybe not as strong in those classes. But I like this use of Discover as like a resource gain mechanic as opposed to drawing cards. Both, I think there's a more interesting dynamic to it, like I discussed earlier, the fact that adding cards to your deck from outside the game, it has relevant strategic value in games against other control decks that are likely to go to fatigue. But I also just think that drawing cards in Hearthstone, and in particular being able to find specific individual cards or draw your entire deck, has long been too easy. And I think that having cards that gain you resources in this way is more interesting and will cause games to play out more differently as opposed to playing out more the same. When you have lots of easy ways to draw cards and thus the ability to effectively draw your entire deck or most of your deck on a regular basis, it just causes games to play out super similarly. We see that a lot with Freeze Mage. But when you have cards like this, which not only are not actually increasing the consistency of your draws, but also bringing in something else from outside the game into your deck, it significantly increases the variety of gameplay, which I think is very valuable. All right. Tomb Spider. 4-cost 3/3 beast, battlecry, discover a beast. Similar thoughts to the Scarab, though I think this card is worse. Spending 4 mana for a 3/3, hashtag feels bad, man. I guess it's not really a hashtag, it's more of an emote, but you can hashtag it too, I suppose. I think this is more of a like arena style card than it will likely be a constructed card, but it is effectively like a 3/3 for 4 draw card, which is kind of like a Gnomish Inventor style card in terms of the value you're getting out of it. But it isn't increasing your deck consistency in that way. So I think that this is a pretty cool card. Maybe it could see play in like really attrition based decks in metagames, but seems difficult to justify playing this over something like a Paladin Shredder. Murloc Tiny Fin. Power creep, oh my god! I think it's a hilarious argument that this is power creep over Wisp because it's a Murloc and that makes it better than Wisp. It's in some ways true. It also makes it vulnerable to Hungry Crab, so it's not strictly better. But I think that this is actually interesting on a number of levels. One, I think it's a strong card for Murloc decks. Being able to make stuff like Tide Hunter relevant faster, being able to have more cheap minions that you can play to enable things like your war leaders, helps enable all those sort of synergies. Things like every fin is awesome. It's basically a coin for that also gets buffed. It does make Murloc Knight possibly able to summon an even weaker thing than it could before. But it also is a strong card with Hobgoblin. Like this is a card that it improves a number of interesting decks from multiple angles. Because it's a Murloc, it's a 0-cost Murloc, and just because it's a 0-cost 1/1, decks that are looking to potentially like leverage any of those particular cross-cutting synergies have this as a tool, which I think is interesting. Huge Toad. It is very sad that this isn't just the feels bad man like emote as a card, because that's basically what it is. But Death Rattle, deal 1 damage to a random enemy, 3/2 beast for 2. I think this is also just kind of just filling out the beast curve with more stuff that's relevant. Oh my god, power creep from Bloodfin Raptor. Oh my god. For those of you who are not catching my sarcasm, power creep is essentially a relevant concept when it refers to cards that are already sort of powerful and used in competitive decks. When a card that isn't played like has a card that is better than it printed, that isn't power creep really. That's just, you know, putting things into a position that cards in that category might see play. Huge Toad is interesting though. Like this is kind of like a flame. You know, obviously Flame Jugger is the battle cry version of this with somewhat reverse stats. I think that Huge Toad is potentially an exciting card in sort of a mid-range style of Hunter deck against like an aggressive deck. Like Huge Toad can kill, you know, your opponent's like Leper Gnome and their Wolf Rider and their Abusive Sergeant, and it is a pretty powerful effect, even though it's often going to do nothing. When it does something that is board impactful, it's extremely effective because there's a huge tempo swing. So I actually think this is a card that could see a significant amount of play. You know, both because it's just a combination of stats and ability are pretty relevant in some cases, and it's the fact it's a beast. So it's also a Huge Toad. Feels good, man. Next we have Fossilized Devilsaur. Battlecry: if you control a beast, gain taunt. 8/8 for 8. So this is kind of like an Iron Bark Protector. In this scenario that you can't, you know, you don't have access to Iron Bark Protector. It also just kind of looks like the skeleton from Night at the Museum, but whatever. This is, you know, mostly looks like it's a card that could potentially be relevant in Arena. I do think that cards like this are interesting for Arena, things that are rewarding you for particular kinds of synergies. And I like the fact that this is a card that is a card that is outside of a class that rewards you for that. You know, it's like you can look at your like deck that you've drafted in Arena and be like, oh, like, you know, how many beasts do I have? Is it possible that Fossilized Devilsaur is like particularly good in my deck? So that's cool. And you know, whether it's a powerful card or not is like, it is clearly a powerful card. Iron Bark Protector in games that go long is quite powerful, but I think that this is, you know, certainly the type of card that makes drafting Arena decks more interesting, because the more they are able to have synergies that can manifest, makes the actual drafting process more fun. Next we have GorillaBot A3. If you control another mech, discover a mech. 3/4 for 4. Again, much like the Beast one, this is kind of the same style of card. Interestingly, we get a 3/4 for 4 rather than a 3/3 for 4. I wish they were differentiated more in terms of their cost and stats. It's very strange that like beasts are just better than mechs, I guess, because it costs more. You know, you spend more of your card budget on discovering a beast, because this only gets to be 3/3, or it gets to be 3/4 instead of 3/3. I guess because there's stuff like Gazrilla, King Crush, or whatever. Though I guess you can only discover King Crush or Gazrilla if you're a hunter. It's not like Unstable Portal, and I guess there's just also more beast synergies than mech synergies. I don't know, but again, this is sort of weird in that like it's competing very clearly with something like Piloted Shredder as far as, you know, tempo. This is more of a long game value style card, whereas Shredder is more impactful tempo wise. I do like all these types of cards here. I guess this also requires you to control a mech to discover a mech, so it's not just like the other one, but worse. So this has a conditional trigger. I do just wish they were differentiated more. I wish that they were like not just this virtually the same stat line and at the same cost. But I like any cards that are sort of tribally synergy based. I think that makes deck building more interesting. Not necessarily like just the pure always want the same type cards, but something like this, which rewards you for tribal synergy, I think is interesting in both Arena and Constructed. All right, then we have Anubisoth Sentinel. Death Rattle, give a random friendly minion +3/+3. This is a very powerful Death Rattle effect. The problem is that it's on a relatively weak body that your opponent can likely kill your other stuff and then kill in their own turn in many cases. I feel like the sort of card that's like probably really powerful when you're ahead, because your opponent isn't able to just trade into your other stuff then kill it. Because even if you can just trade this into something with like one other guy in play, it's extremely strong. So I think this is actually a very, very, very powerful card, likely in Arena. Probably borderline-ish for Constructed. Probably won't see play in tournament decks, though. Wobbling Runts. This card's hilarious. 6 cost 2/6 Death Rattle, summon 3 2/2 runts. So, just 3 guys in a coat, pretend to be a big guy. Pretty neat. This is actually like a pretty strong card. Like you're getting a ton of stats for what you're spending on it. It's very similar to a worse version of Savannah Highmane. So if you're in the market for Savannah Highmane, kind of sweet. But the fact that it is like in Kabbalah range is also is kind of disastrous. I think this is likely to be a reasonable card in Arena just because it's pretty high value, but it is very low tempo because it does very little damage for its cost. So I think it's more of a fun conceptual card than it is likely to be a competitive card. Summoning Stone. This is the Tavern Brawl made real, and I think this is a cool card because it is rewarding you pretty heavily if you are playing like expensive spells. Like this goes super well with like Force of Nature and things that are giving you board impact immediately. I don't think its health is high enough to really try and build a deck around this. I think if this had like 8 health, maybe this would be a card that you could try and build a deck that like legitimately used it in a competitive capacity because it would be pretty likely to be able to survive. But at 6 health, it just feels like it is really low impact, like difficult to keep around long enough to take advantage of. Eerie Statue. So this is 7/7 for 4. Cannot attack unless it's the only minion in the battlefield. Wouldn't it be only minion on the battlefield? I just think that text-wise that makes not much sense. Anyway, this is kind of a neat card. It encourages you to use like board wipe effects, and it's like a card that you want in like a low minion count deck, or at least a deck that has very few early game minions. The fact that it can't attack unless your opponent has no minions, like if this couldn't attack unless it was the only minion you controlled, I think it'd be super good. But you have to also just be able to kill all your opponent's other minions to get this guy to be able to attack, and do so with spells and weapons because you can't attack if there's other minions. So I don't know. This is a neat card that I think will encourage people to try and take advantage of it. This is, though, at the same time, it's a card that I think actually kind of illustrates the problem with Big Game Hunter in a pretty clear effect. Like, if you wanted to build an Eerie Statue deck, like you'll just get punished by people who are playing Big Game Hunter, even if you are able to finally reach the conditional. It's like, okay, your opponent's able to kill your stuff. Okay, well, it just gets Big Game Hunter. Sorry. So I think this would be a cool card that people might try to build decks around if it weren't so easily countered by such a popular card. All right, Ancient Shade. A 7/4 for 4 Battlecry. Shuffle an Ancient Curse in your deck that deals 7 damage to you when drawn. It's kind of cool. I don't know if the Ancient Curse is also like the Mine or whatever, that you draw a card to replace it. If you don't draw a card, it's a lot bigger deal. But it's also, again, this is a card with a pretty huge drawback. Has big stats, but very easy to kill, and dies to Big Game Hunter. So it's cool, but it's probably not going to see anywhere near as much play as something like a Fel Reaver, which is harder for your opponent to deal with, and has ultimately a smaller drawback in most games. Yeah, just dies to True Silver, dies to Shredder. Not worth it. Naga Sea Witch. This is a cool card. So Naga Sea Witch is a card that you can definitely just build decks around. You can play 2 copies of this. It's one of the important things about like decks you can actually build your decks around. Like a lot of legendary cards, it's difficult to build a deck around a legendary. If it's like a card that like something like Baron Rivendare. It's like you can play Baron Rivendare in a deck, and sometimes it'll come up and its synergies will manifest, but like you only ever draw that every so often because it's a legendary card. Naga Sea Witch, though, is a card that you can actually play in any deck, and you can play 2 copies of it, and it's really cool because like you can potentially play it and another card that costs however much mana in the same turn. Obviously, you already have 10 mana, so if you played it alongside something that costs 10, you already could have played the thing that costs 10. But if you play this at like turn 5 and your opponent doesn't kill it, like you can play Aviana next turn or whatever. You can play Deathwing, whatever else, and that's all pretty cool. So I like that this is a sort of card that can spawn like an entirely new deck. I don't know if those decks will be good, but it is really interesting in how it will allow you to potentially like try to build around it with these big powerful legendaries. So I'm also curious how this plays with Aviana, as I just mentioned. Like Aviana says your minions cost 1. This says your cards cost 5. Who wins in a fight? All right, Jin of Zephyrs. Whenever you cast a spell on another friendly minion, cast a copy of it on this one. Pretty cool with Hunter's Hat or whatever, the Explorer's Hat. You can, get extra copies on this guy, and then he gains the Death Rattle effect. And you get even more hats. Oh my god. I think it's cool that there are more cards that care about targeting your minions. Like we've seen Lightbane and Darkbane Sisters. We've seen Dragonkin Sorcerer. And I hope that we will get to the point that there's enough of those that that's a strategy you can build toward with something like Druid, with Mark of the Wild, Priest, with like Powered Shield and Valen's Chosen, whatever else. But the Hunter too, with the hat. More hats! More hats! Alright, we're into the legendaries now. So they're all the legendaries are neutral. And this card is super cool. Elise Starseeker, shuffle the map to the Golden Monkey into your deck. Map to the Golden Monkey is a spell that shuffles the Golden Monkey into your deck, and you draw a card. And the Golden Monkey is the 4-cost 6/6 that has the battle cry of 4-cost 6/6 Taunt, has the battle cry of your hand and deck become legendary minions, which is super cool. I am definitely going to be building decks, like trying to utilize this. I don't think that it's actually like a particularly strong competitive strategy, but it's certainly a cool and fun strategy. And again, I've mentioned this a number of times, and I think it's important that those things just exist, even if they're not competitive. That they are things that people spend their time and energy trying to explore because they are just cool and fun. I do think that it's possible that you can build a deck that does utilize this effect very well. Like you can play a deck that is almost all like just cheap removal effects and control style cards, and you don't even necessarily need to play like big late game minions to win the game, because you can ultimately just try and control the game with all your removal, and then Golden Monkey, okay, now I just win the game from here. It does remove your ability to like interact efficiently at that point, so it's not just like a pure like upside, hey, Golden Monkey, I did it. But I do think that it does change the dynamic of the way that you can construct your deck, thanks to that Battlecry effect. All right, Bran's Brawnbeard, or rather, Bran Bronzebeard. So this is certainly a really cool card. Your battle cries trigger twice. So my understanding is that the way this works is that if it is a targeted battle cry effect, it targets the same thing twice. So it doesn't actually give you bonus effects from things like Big Game Hunter. If you do play it with like Fire Elemental, it only actually shoots the same thing twice. So you can kill a 6/6 with a Fire Elemental, but you can't kill 2 separate 3/3s. And this is the sort of card, kind of like I was just talking about with Baron Rivendare, is like, I'd love to build a deck around this, but you need more incentive. You need like, because you can only play one copy of Bran Bronzebeard, it's difficult to, ensure that you're actually going to draw him. And this is actually, I think, one of the things with like the cheap legendary cards, like high cost legendary cards, because you will spend more of the game getting to that point. You'll naturally draw them by the time you have enough mana to cast them more often. Whereas the games that you'll draw Bran when you have 3 mana is like relatively low. But I do think that with this in combination with other things that will reward you with battle cries, like the Rumbling Elemental and Shaman, could be cool, because you have a lot of things that sort of cross-cutting synergies. That like, okay, well, if I draw Bran, great, these things do this. If I draw the Rumbling Elemental, I still am rewarded for my battle cry effects. But I do think this is a very powerful card, with things that draw cards, with things that discover, with things like, Defender of Argus, or Fire Elemental again, or Varian or whatever. Like, it's a super powerful card when it is online. So maybe it's better off that it doesn't come up as often, that it is a legendary card, but it does make it harder to build a deck around. But definitely, this is definitely a card that I will be building decks around, and I do think that it is certainly extremely strong. All right, Sir Finley Murgleton. He is 1/3 for 1. Battle cry, discover a new basic hero power. So the fact he's a 1-cost 1/3 Murloc in itself is like kind of an interesting thing, because it does help provide a stable body for like Murloc decks if they do care about having Murlocs in play with things like War Leader. And the Battle Cry, discover a new basic hero power. It's weird because this is a card that could be very strong in a lot of decks that like want to do something that is different from what their class drives them to do in general. Like if you wanted to play an aggressive warrior deck or aggressive priest deck or I don't know, any shaman deck, you may want a hero power different than the one that the game naturally gives you. So this is a way that you can do that, and I think that it's possible that this card will end up seeing a lot of play in any of those sort of decks, because this isn't like, oh, you play it in this kind of deck. It's like you actually just play this in any deck that is trying to do something different than what its hero power naturally pushes it to do. Something like like aggro priest or control hunter or aggro warrior or any number of these things. And that's actually a hallmark of like I think a pretty cool card, because it can have a role across a lot of different places. So I will definitely be trying to play some of these decks, like Control Hunter, like Aggro Warrior, and the like. And I imagine Sir Finley Murgleton will find a home in all of them. All right, Reno Jackson. So this is another card that really changes the way that people might think about playing and building their decks. So from my understanding, the way this battle card works is that it looks at your deck currently, not your deck as a whole. So like you don't have to build your deck with just one copy of everything in it. You can build a deck that has 2 copies of some cards, but if they have more than one card remaining in your deck when you play him, his ability won't trigger. So this is, again, something that is a very powerful effect that can really swing games dramatically when you are playing against a deck where this is a key element of the game. Like if you're playing against something like Freeze Mage, if you're playing against something like Face Hunter, any aggressive deck, really, this is an incredibly strong effect when you are able to pull it off. And I can imagine playing decks that are like pretty are using more different cards as a result, because you can play like, instead of playing double, like if you have decks that are like have lots of possible analogous effects, like you probably wouldn't play this in like Druid, because Druid most of the time is going to pretty much always want to play 2 Wild Growths, 2 Innervates. But if you're like playing a deck that has more options at various costs, like generally going to be a control deck, because this is an effect that is most powerful in a control deck. But you can have an entire variety of different things that are around the same general goal. So it's interesting. This is a card that inherently pushes you to do things that are different, to have games, build decks in such a way that games will play out differently, because more different cards are likely to be involved. So certainly a very cool card, and I will definitely be building my Highlander style decks to take advantage of it, because there can be only one. And last, and perhaps least, Archthief Rafam. So our dramatic villain of the whole story is a 7/8 for 9 with Battlecry, discover a powerful artifact. And the powerful artifacts, let's find those real quick. They are, here they are. Doot. Powerful artifacts. They are Mirror of Doom, Timepiece of Horror, and Lantern of Power, which fill your board with 3/3 zombie mummies, deal 10 damage randomly split among all enemies, and give a minion +10/+10. So, I mean, yes, these are pretty powerful in the right circumstances. Giving a minion +10/+10, obviously pretty strong. But spending 9 mana on a 7/8 that has no other immediate impact in the game is kind of sad. I imagine that in like really attrition-based matchups, like something like the Mirror of Doom could be very strong. I'm kind of sad that none of these are cards that like can get you back into a game when you're really losing. I mean, obviously, fill your board with 3/3 zombies. If you are really far behind on the board, that's great. But all of them are things that if you spend your turn 9 playing this thing and you're really far behind on the board, that like you can't cast it. I mean, I guess you could theoretically cast Timepiece of Horror and hope that you kill all your opponent's minions, but it costs your entire turn. So I'm not really buying this card. I think that it's cool, but not really something that looks like it's going to be nearly as effective as a lot of the other options that already exist. I mean, compare this to like Ysera, compare this to, I mean, even like Nefarian. Nefarian is very, very similar. Obviously, you don't get any individual, you're very unlikely to get any individual card as strong as these from Nefarian, but like you get 2 of them, and you also get Dragon's Energies, which is pretty important. But I don't know. I'm pretty unimpressed by the powerful artifacts. They are obviously all like pretty high impact things, but they all cost 10 mana. So you're effectively using your entire turn, 2 turns, before you can actually play any of these. So maybe they're good. I'll definitely try them, but thus far I'm certainly not excited by any of the artifacts. So I don't know. Overall, I think the set is really cool. It looks like there's a lot of interesting cards, and I do think that it will have a pretty significant impact on the metagame. There are a lot of cards that do enable or empower decks that are not necessarily particularly popular right now. Probably my top cards from the set. Let's take a look at the list overall. I would say my top cards from the set, as far as likely to be impactful in Constructed. I'd say that my top cards are probably Tunnel Trog in Shaman. I think is definitely one of the top cards. I would also say Bran Bronzebeard, I think, is likely to be a pretty popular and powerful card. I don't know that it's going to be impactful enough, just because it is hard to build a deck around it. But when you do play Bran in a lot of decks, it's just so powerful when you get like multiple triggers of things. Like Bran in a deck that has like just like Healbot. It's like I'll play Bran and I can play Healbot in the same turn and gain 16 life. That's a really, really powerful effect. So I expect Bran to be a pretty big player in the format overall. Also, I really like Entomb. I think Entomb is one of the strongest cards in the set. It is a very powerful card for any kind of priest control deck. That definitely helps with a lot of the problems that control priest decks can have. Gives you a lot of ways to deal with otherwise problematic cards, and helps you win fatigue wars. And then probably Desert Camel is another top one. I think Desert Camel is a card that will enable pretty strongly mid-range hunter decks, which are already good, but I do think that it may even, if hunter decks with Desert Camel do become popular, it may even see people sort of rework the way that they build their decks so that they have at least a 1-drop in their decks that the Camel is able to pull out for them. So yeah, I think those are the cards that I'm at least most excited about. As to whether those are the best cards, maybe not. It's possible that there's some other stuff in there. Oh, and then Tomb Pillager is actually another card that I'm really excited about. Tomb Pillager, I should probably make a more defined list of these top cards, but Tomb Pillager is another card that I am really excited about, because I do think that it is a card that will potentially enable different types of rogue decks than we've really seen exist so far. I think that the coin off of the minion dying will fundamentally change the way that you can approach building rogue decks as far as like playing big late game minions is concerned. So yeah, that's it for now. I will probably do a more detailed write-up on my website potentially with my thoughts on a lot of the cards, and probably a more defined top like 5 or 10 card list when I have more time to think about it. But I'm really excited to play with these cards. I think there's a lot of really cool things in here that will be a lot of fun to build decks around and to play with. So anyway, let us here boop. All right, let's just play some Hearthstone here. Here we go, Hearthstone. I gotta actually open Hearthstone to do that, huh? All right, I'm gonna take a very short break, like 2 minutes, I'll be right back as Hearthstone loads up and we jump into the game. Gotta let Natalie know that I'm done with my actual review here, so she can potentially edit this together for my YouTube. So we'll be right back. Don't go anywhere. All right, I'm back. So, I think I'm kind of sick. At BlizzCon all weekend,